All right, today I will be talking about Jose Saramago's All the Names, translated by Margaret Jull Costa. And I have to say, this was really unexpected because I had read two of Saramago's works previously. Um, One was Blindness, which was recommended to me as a Murakami fan. The other was The Double, which I purchased because Enemy, a film by the director of Blade Runner 2049, actually, is one that I very much enjoy, and I did not realize it was based on a novel. So to find out that it was made me instantly have to check it out. And I have to say, Blindness, it was okay, but I found Saramago's style. He writes in very, very long paragraphs with no breaks and very little stylistically to follow along. I find that very difficult to deal with. In Blindness, it was sort of justified as adding to the confusion of the situation, but very quickly that excuse falls apart because it's just how he writes. So, in that sense, Blindness, there's nothing special about it. In that sense, being written that way that's specific to blindness. And it can be actually headache inducing to me. I think that paragraphs and line breaks for quotes and whatnot, I understand that, like, in the case of Blindness, had that been the intention, I would have been fine with it. But in terms of just reading, I find it genuinely actually physically gives me a headache to read. I have to take painkillers to read Saramago's books, which is not much of a an aspect of praise in my eyes, but that's pros and cons. Point being, nonetheless, when I read The Double, I enjoyed it a bit more than Blindness, but at the same time, because it was based off of a movie that I'd seen multiple times, it didn't have the sort of originality that I was quite looking for. But All the Names, boy, absolutely made me appreciate Saramago. And while the style is still very difficult for me, and still were a few nights where I had to take a painkiller, I found it much easier to read. Maybe I'm just getting acclimated to the style, or maybe I'm just in a mindset where I'm able to just go more slowly and not be bothered with it. Either way, great book, and particularly coming off of both Abe's The Ruined Map, which was too ambiguous for me. I wasn't able to quite understand it, or A Man, which was too poignant, too obvious, too blunt for me. All the Names was just a perfect in between. So I picked it just because like I said, I've always kind of liked the idea of Saramago's works, but it felt like something that could click for me. Never did. Finally did. Really happy about that. And the summary, the synopsis, is just really compelling. It's about a person who works at the Central Registry, which is where they keep a record of everyone's births, marriages, and deaths, named Senor Jose. And he goes, and what he does is pardon, I'm recording this with a sore throat, so there will be starts and stops. Senor Jose is in his downtime at the Central Registry, which is this incredibly bureaucratic place. Obviously speaking, he has this hobby where he collects famous people, by which I mean he collects newspaper clippings and other material of famous individuals. And one day he gets it into his head that, seeing as he works at the Central Registry and his house is actually not a house but a room connected directly to the Central Registry, that he has access after hours to the Central Registry. And he decides to take his quote-unquote famous people collection to the next level by entering the Central Registry and copying out the registry cards. And in doing this, he discovers the card for somebody he refers to as the Unknown Woman. whose name is known, but he becomes infatuated with her and goes on a quest to track her down. Only, and this is something that isn't really a spoiler so much, but I think is a key aspect to the plot, or understanding the plot, it would be very easy for him to track her down, but he goes about it deliberately in the most obtuse way possible. So that is the story. Would I recommend this book? Absolutely. Saramago's style, particularly the lack of paragraph breaks, is really a pain in the ass to deal with. Especially, like I said, it causes me actual physical difficulty to read. But I do think that the story is short enough, well told, poignant enough, and just really interesting and engaging. So if you are the type of person who can put up with that, I would recommend it. I usually talk about people I would recommend a book to, but it's difficult to think of somebody that I wouldn't recommend this to if you have any interest in literature or thought-provoking literature, which is to say, if you're more of a fantasy sci-fi type of person, genre fiction, just reading for entertainment, I can't really say that I would recommend this. It is a detective story insofar as there is a person who is looking down an individual, but the detective aspect is very much not front and center. It's literature insofar as it is very much about the characters and their journey, more so than it is the plot. So, but it's short. Aside from the difficulties with understanding Saramago's long paragraphs, there's no reason that I would not recommend this to anybody. So moving on to the pros and the cons. I've already mentioned the cons several times. Difficult to read Saramago's paragraph style. The fact that characters don't have line breaks when they're speaking means that everything can get into a jumble that may require rereading. It is not the easiest thing in the world to follow and read. Not that it's obscenely difficult or anything like that. Certainly there have been much more difficult books that I have read and have read about. So this is no John Fosse, the entire book is one fucking prolonged paragraph and it's 1,000-page long paragraph type thing. None of that. It's just that the paragraphs go on for pages with no breaks and everything kind of rushes together. So you'll end up going back having to reread through certain things. But as for the prose, I think what this book does really well that is so captivating to me is the way that it draws insight into the sort of bureaucratic side of dealing with life. And that's kind of getting more into themes a bit and analysis later on. But suffice to say, I think it really draws attention to the bureaucratic necessity of tracking lives, but at the same time, the way that in the process of doing that, you lose track of the individuals at stake. And I really like that theme. I really like that idea. I think that Senor Jose's journey is understandable both in, as I said, the aforementioned contrast between bureaucratic necessity and life as it's lived, but also in the sort of soul-crushing bureaucratic job that he works and his journey. I think it's all really well handled. I think it's really interesting, and it's not something that I see done a lot, but I also really like the larger-than-life way that it's presented. I struggle with calling it Kafkaesque, but certainly because it never goes quite into the fully absurd realm. Even with some of its, like I said, slightly larger-than-life elements, they feel larger than life to me, but at the same time, I could sort of understand them, in fact, being very real and can easily picture them being real in a way that necessarily, like I said, things that I describe as Kafkaesque aren't. So it's elevated. I mean, as a fan of Murakami and magical realism and surrealism, I could have been fine with it going further, but I think it's elevated just enough to really sort of heighten these elements of the story without being distracting unto themselves. And outside of the fact of the paragraphs being long, I think that the prose itself is really well written, and there's a playfulness to it that keeps the story from devolving into being overly depressive or overly, I don't want to say bureaucratic, but sort of oppressive, I guess is the right word, where it's narrated in a third-person omniscient point of view, and sometimes it even flips between, very briefly it'll dip into present tense, and I'm not sure if that's a translation thing or not, but sometimes the narrator will go on what-ifs, on things that could happen. It'll have prolonged scenes that it turns out never actually played out, but the idea of it all is to lend a sort of, this is very much a story, and to keep things grounded. I almost want to say whimsy, but it reminds me very much of a sort of an old storyteller type thing, that this is a story being told to you, not something directly following. And in this case, it adds a level of levity and disconnection from what could ultimately be a very depressing and crushing sort of story. So the levity of it is great. The sort of tongue-in-cheek element of it is great. There's such a perfect balance to all the elements that keep it from going too far one direction or the other, and it feels like it adds the appropriate amount of weight to everything. The pacing is really spot on. Like I said, it's short, but at the same time very poignant. And I mentioned this in the beginning in terms of it doesn't beat you over the head with its message, but at the same time that there is, the sort of repetition of some of the things is not blunt repetition. It's to draw your attention, but it ultimately trusts you enough to let you draw your own conclusions. So, really, I think the only con is the fact that the sort of paragraphs and way that it's written, which again is going to vary by person to person. I know a lot of people will argue that this is a pro to them, so take that for what it's worth. So to move on into the analysis, because that's where I really want to get into. So full spoilers ahead. And I do say analysis and not themes, because this kind of reminds me of a sort of Murakami type book where what you take away from it, I think that there are sort of universal things that you're going to take away from it, but there are also things that everybody is going to take away their own aspect, depending on which aspect they particularly focus on, because it's very clear from the repetition of the death in life is the sort of one of the most important elements to the book. The sort of final conclusion of the book, that the dead should be placed along with the living, that you have both the central registry and the cemetery both expanded beyond what anybody could have sort of expected or planned for, and both continue to expand. The fact that the woman that he spends this whole time searching after commits suicide, and he never actually finds this woman, so this whole time there's this sort of expectancy of what will he do once he finally finds this woman, and then she's dead at the end, and she committed suicide while he was searching for her, and had he gone the direct route, he would have found her in time, and who knows what would have happened then, and that's sort of left ambiguous. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that sort of the dead and remembrance of the dead is a very important element to the book, with it sort of concluding on the fact that the dead are only really dead if we forget about them, but that their sort of legacy and memory lives on. And I think this is really embodied in when he's traveling through the cemetery. You see the various forms of architecture that shift as he sort of travels through this journey. It's like traveling through history, and the sort of remembrance and the influence of those things continues forward. But then also you have the shepherd at the end who is scrambling the numbers on the graves, so that you don't know if the person that you're actually trying to remember is the person that is actually, buried beneath the earth. The person, the grave that you're standing before is actually the person that you're trying to remember. So sort of the dead's rule, respecting the dead, letting the dead be forgotten, and how to remember the dead are certainly like sort of big themes in the book that the book repeats many, many times, and they're there, and I really appreciate them, and I thought about them. But for me personally, the big thing that really stuck with me was the aforementioned sort of bureaucracy of it all, and the way in which the necessity of keeping a record of every single person, especially back in the days before digitalization, but digitalization will ultimately come into the same problem. It was just more pronounced back then, is the sort of physical space necessary to keep track of everybody, same with the cemetery to bury all the bodies, demands a sort of reduction to, in order to just be practical. They mentioned that the central registry is constantly expanding because the more people are born, the more cards you add. And that it's only through sort of paper degradation, moths, silverfish, and rats that things aren't already twice as bad as they are, because you add so many new cards, but you never really take old cards out. At the same time, there is you have the cemetery where they never dig anyone up, so it's just expanding. And he mentions the map with all the names on it, when Senior Jose goes to the cemetery in order to find this unknown woman's grave, he's given a map, and the person who gives him the map says that it's all based on the numbers, because if there was a map big enough to include the names of all the buried people, it would be larger than the world. So even in death, these people are reduced to numbers, which then the shepherd sort of switches around, which, shepherd, very obvious Jesus analogy, but that's fine, whatever. Switches around so that even the numbers which are meant to correspond to individuals don't line up in that way. But then you also have Senior Jose, who, working within this system, has a very unique insight into it, insofar as he is exposed to the sort of reduction of people. And you have the contrast between his sort of famous collection of individuals whose lives are tracked, are documented, and are remembered sometimes, versus the sort of natural everyday people like this unknown woman, who, even though she existed, almost all record of her existence can be fit onto a little tiny card. And his sort of quest to go about finding her is not only a quest to give her humanity and restore humanity to her, but also to restore his own humanity, in the sense that he himself is sort of exposed constantly to this bureaucratic reduction of humans and people to names and dates, and at the cemetery numbers. And his journey is really a way to claw back a sense of meaning to life. And one of the things that I really found interesting was the humanity expressed by the register, the sort of head in this very strict bureaucratic system, where he's at the top, where he is described as this very dismissive figure, but who ultimately, despite being obviously aware, it's not like a twist at the end that he knew everything that was going on. It's a twist to Jose, because Jose is so caught up in everything, but as the reader, you're aware that he knows what's happening and what Jose is doing. But the twist that this sort of figurehead, who is often treated very inhumanely by the rest of the staff, who have this very strict bureaucratic order that they keep to, is himself a human and has human emotions. And it's kind of a reminder that even though we have our roles in life and we have our roles to fill, the way I took his humanity is that it's important to remember that the people in these roles are ultimately humans with emotions, and no matter how high or low you are, from the lowliest clerk in Jose to the height of the register himself, regardless of the sort of way that the position can break you down, can force you to fit a mold, you as an individual will never be completely submerged into this system, into becoming just a figurehead. That you will always have your own ways of breaking and twisting the rules, your own ways of leaving behind your own legacy, even if it risks becoming little more than deleting a card, a certificate of death, so that somebody lives on forever. So, a very short story, but I feel like I've only touched on some of the things that I've really thought about with this book. But the fact that a book that is less than 250 pages can accomplish so much, which granted, I guess if it was spaced out and tabbed out more traditionally like what we would expect, it would probably be substantially longer. Not substantially, but it might be like 270 pages instead. But whatever. Point is, for such a short book, I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed what it had to offer. I really enjoyed that it made me think in a way that I don't want to say too much more, because I want people to read this book and I want people to come to their own conclusions about it. So please do, and I will see you next time.